Britain does justice rather well, or so we tell ourselves. Magistrates in wigs, barristers in gowns, the scales of Lady Justice gleaming above the Old Bailey. We have spent centuries perfecting the theatre of law and order. But behind certain doors, in certain wings, something lingers that official records would rather forget. Scattered across these islands are prisons where officers go quiet when you ask about the old blocks. Institutions where the incident logs mention things that governors prefer not to discuss. Victorian hulks where something happened and the walls themselves seem to remember. I have gone through prison archives, freedom of information requests, and testimonies from former officers to bring you 15 prisons where something is deeply and genuinely wrong. Let us begin in Somerset, with a prison that has leaned into its reputation so completely that it now offers ghost tours to paying visitors. Shepton Mallet Prison was built in 1610 as a county jail. It held debtors, thieves, and those awaiting transportation to the colonies. When it finally closed in 2013, it was the oldest operating prison in the United Kingdom. 189 men were held within walls that had witnessed over 4 centuries of human misery. What most visitors do not know is what happened here during the Second World War. Under the Visiting Forces Act of 1942, Shepton Mallet became an American military prison. 18 servicemen were executed within these walls. 16 were hanged in the execution block. 2 were shot by firing squad in the prison yard. Their average age was 21.5 years old. The racial composition of those executed tells its own story. 10 were African American, 3 were Latino, 5 were white. Of all the men put to death in the European theatre, 79% were black. The military justice system was not blind. Initially, the remains of these executed soldiers were buried in unmarked graves at a place called Plot Tents in Brookwood Cemetery, Surrey. Plot Tents sat in a distant corner, away from honoured dead, next to tool sheds and a compost heap. The executed were not given coffins. They were placed in cotton mattress covers and buried under numbered markers. No names, no dignity, even in death. In the 1950s, something began happening at Shepton Mallet that forced the Home Office to take notice. Prisoners became increasingly uncomfortable in their cells. Officers started refusing night shifts. The Home Office conducted a 3-day investigation. The results remained officially inconclusive. The publican at the local inn will tell you what the report did not. The apparition of Private Lee Davis has been seen by multiple witnesses. He was one of the executed servicemen, put to death for rape and murder. Staff members have reported another figure, a man in American military uniform walking through walls, following corridors that no longer exist. Some believe he was killed in the yard by a stray bullet during an execution he was overseeing. The prison offers ghost tours now. The gift shop sells merchandise. But former officers who worked those wings will not discuss what they saw. They simply confirm that they kept the lights on. Travelling northwest to Shropshire, we find Shrewsbury Prison, which opened in 1793 and quickly became overcrowded with double its designed capacity. Public executions took place regularly outside its gates for one of 220 offences that carried the death sentence. Everything from murder to stealing a loaf of bread. The executed were buried in unmarked graves within the prison walls. They remain there still. Guards at Shrewsbury frequently refused duty on the most haunted wings. They reported being pushed downstairs when no one was behind them, doors slamming in empty corridors, footsteps above them when they were on the top floor. The hanging room was used until 1961, then converted into a group therapy room. Former officers describe it as the most active area in the building, possibly because it sits directly adjacent to the condemned cell where men spent their final hours. One of the prison's most documented spirits is the Grey Lady, a shadowy female figure seen wandering the corridors at night. Some believe she is the ghost of a prisoner's wife who took her own life after her husband was hanged. Witnesses describe a mist-like figure in a wing. A cold chill accompanies every sighting. Visitors have reported faint crying in empty hallways where no living person stands. Then there is the Shadow Man of Sea Wing, a dark figure seen lurking in corners late at night. Those who have encountered him describe a suffocating feeling, a sudden sense of being watched from just behind your shoulder. Investigators using thermal cameras have reportedly captured a figure that does not emit body heat. When the prison was operational, some officers simply refused to work Sea Wing alone after dark. The prison closed in 2013. The reports have not stopped. Further southwest in Cornwall, Bodmin Jail presents a different kind of darkness. Built in 1779 and operational for 150 years, it was the first British prison to hold prisoners in individual cells. This was considered progressive at the time. Isolation was believed to encourage reflection and penitence. What it actually encouraged was madness. From the prison's opening until 1909, 55 executions took place. 51 of these hangings were public spectacles. 8 of those executed were women. The crimes for which people were hanged included murder, certainly, but also sheep stealing, stealing a purse, forgery, and burglary. A stolen sheep could cost you your life. In 1844, a crowd of over 250,000 people gathered outside Bodmin Jail to watch the execution of the Lightfoot brothers. They had been convicted of robbing and murdering a local timber merchant. The clamour to watch them die was so intense that train carriages carrying around 1,100 spectators stopped on the railway line that ran alongside the jail. 250,000 people watching 2 men choked to death on a rope. Entertainment for the masses. What makes Bodmin genuinely disturbing is what happened during renovations in 2019. Builders reported such troubling experiences inside Cell 4 that the cell was sealed up entirely. Visitors since have reported being shoved by invisible hands. They have felt pressure around their throats, as though being strangled. They have watched the cell door open by itself. There is a local belief about why Bodmin Jail holds onto its dead so tightly. Executed convicts were buried with their feet pointing towards the prison itself. The superstition was that they could never leave the site, even in death. Their souls would always face the walls that had confined them. To this day, no bodies from those unmarked graves have been found. But they are there, somewhere beneath the gift shop and the escape room attractions. Feet pointing inward. Forever. Now we must shift to something harder. Places where the darkness comes not from ghosts or superstition, but from systems designed to break human beings. Pentonville Prison in North London opened in 1842 and became the model for British incarceration. A further 54 prisons were built to similar designs over the following 6 years. Hundreds more throughout the British Empire. The sun never set on Pentonville's architectural children. The regime was called the separate system. It was promoted as humane reform. In practice, it was psychological torture, refined to industrial efficiency. Pentonville operated like a machine. Every minute of the convict's day, from 5:30 in the morning until lights out at 9 in the evening, was regimented. Prisoners were forbidden to communicate with each other. They were locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. When they were moved through the prison, their faces were covered by hoods. They saw no one. They spoke to no one. They existed in total isolation, surrounded by hundreds of others in identical silence. An official report eventually admitted what this system produced. For every 60,000 persons imprisoned in Pentonville, there were 220 cases of insanity, 210 cases of delusion, and 40 suicides. The separate system was a factory for madness. Charles Dickens visited and condemned it as cruel and wrong. He called it slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain. Peter Lorre, president of Bethlehem Hospital, complained that 40 prisoners had been transferred from Pentonville to his asylum by 1847. The prison was 5 years old. 120 men were hanged at Pentonville between 1902 and 1961. an average of 2 executions per year. Among those executed were Timothy Evans, wrongfully convicted for murders actually committed by his neighbour John Christie. Evans was hanged on the 9th of March 1950. Christie himself was hanged in the same prison on the 15th of July 1953. In 2015, Justice Secretary Michael Gove described Pentonville as the most dramatic example of failure within the prison estate. A prisoner was stabbed to death on the 18th of October 2016. 6 more stabbings followed in the subsequent weeks. A report from 2025 found that over a third of prisoners felt suicidal on arrival at Pentonville. 38%. There had been 5 self-inflicted deaths at the prison since July 2022. 3 of those occurred in 2025 alone. The model prison still stands. The model has never worked. In Berkshire, Reading Jail tells the story of one man's destruction at the hands of Victorian justice. Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency in 1895 and sentenced to 2 years hard labour, the maximum penalty. He was moved between several prisons before arriving at Reading, where he would spend the final 18 months of his sentence. Reading Jail was designed by George Gilbert Scott, based on the Pentonville model. The regime was called hard labour, hard fare, and a hard bed. Inmates walked treadmills. They picked oakum until their fingers bled. They slept on wooden planks. They ate food designed for survival, not sustenance. Oscar Wilde, the most celebrated wit in London, the man who had filled theatres with laughter, collapsed during chapel from illness and hunger. His right eardrum was ruptured in the fall. That injury would later contribute to his death. The chaplain at Wandsworth, where Wilde had been held previously, wrote to the Home Office in desperation. He is now quite crushed and broken. Some of our most experienced officers openly say that they do not think he will be able to go through the 2 years. Cell C-33 was where Wilde was incarcerated for approximately 18 months. Visitors today report feeling goosebumps upon entering. One MP who campaigned to preserve the prison described it as a time capsule. The walls that heard a genius weeping still stand. Wilde survived his sentence. Barely. He was released in May 1897. He left England immediately and never returned. He died in Paris 3 years later, aged 46, broken by a system designed specifically to break him. In August 2024, independent monitors found Wandsworth Prison, where Wilde had first been held, to be crumbling, overcrowded, and vermin-infested. Inmates were living in half the cell space available when the prison first opened in 1851. 173 years of progress had made things worse. On the high moors of Devon, Dartmoor Prison presents a horror that history has largely forgotten. The prison was originally built to hold prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars, but during the War of 1812, it became home to 6,500 American prisoners. If Dartmoor had been located in the United States, it would have been the 20th largest city in the country. Here it was, perched on bleak moorland, holding a population of Americans suffering that most have never heard of. In 1810 alone, 419 prisoners died within those walls. Malnutrition, disease, exposure to the brutal Dartmoor weather. A prisoner's graveyard with over 1,000 burials remains on site to this day. What happened in April 1815 was something else entirely. Trigger-happy British guards opened fire on American prisoners in what became known as the Dartmoor Massacre. 9 Americans died. The massacre coincided with the end of the war. Neither Britain nor the United States wanted to resume hostilities over dead prisoners. The 9 men became footnotes. The last casualties of a war both sides wanted to forget. There is another aspect of Dartmoor's history that rarely gets mentioned. After just a few months of imprisonment, white American prisoners requested to be separated from their black compatriots. The British authorities granted this request. Dartmoor became the first racially segregated prison in American history. The practice that would define American incarceration for the next 2 centuries began in Britain, As recently as 1971, Dartmoor was the last prison in the United Kingdom where guards, mounted on horseback and armed with rifles, took prisoners to work in a quarry breaking rocks. Victorian punishment persisted into the era of colour television. Today, Dartmoor stands empty. In 2024, the prison was closed for radon mitigation works. Radioactive gas was seeping from the granite beneath. The moor itself had been poisoning the prison for years. No one noticed until recently. Crossing the Irish Sea to Belfast, we find Crumlin Road Jail, locally known as the Crum. Established in 1845, its layout was inspired by Pentonville Prison. 4 wings fanning out from a central hub. The architectural DNA of psychological torture spreading across the empire. In 1846, the first 106 inmates arrived. Men, women, and children literally marched 11 miles in chains from Carrickfergus Prison. The conditions were brutal from the beginning. Impoverished children as young as 6 or 7 were held for petty crimes such as stealing food from market stalls. Throughout its operation until closure in 1996, the jail detained over 25,000 individuals. 17 prisoners were executed within its walls. The last was Robert McGladdery, hanged in 1961 for the murder of Pearl Gamble. The condemned spent their final hours in a cell large enough for 2 guards to live alongside them. No privacy, even in death. The bodies of the executed were buried inside the prison in unconsecrated ground. During the Troubles, Crumlin Road became a political flashpoint. In October 1971, the Red Cross inspected the prison and found 864 prisoners and internees crammed into a building designed for 475, 3 men to a cell built for 1. The violence outside the walls reflected inside them. The prison is now recognised as one of the most haunted locations in Northern Ireland. Visitors and staff have reported disembodied voices, footsteps in empty corridors, doors slamming shut without cause. A man has been seen walking down C Wing before disappearing through a solid wall. The Crum held its prisoners even after they died. Lancaster Castle in Lancashire has served as a prison since the 12th century. Its latest incarnation was Her Majesty's Prison Lancaster, a Category C prison that remained operational until March 2011, 800 years of continuous incarceration within the same walls. Lancaster hanged more people than anywhere in England outside of London. This earned it the nickname the Hanging Town. More than 265 public hangings took place between 1762 and 1865. Cattle theft was a hanging offence. So was forgery. So was being poor and desperate. The Lancashire witch trials of 1612 remain Lancaster's darkest chapter. 10 people convicted of witchcraft at the summer assize went to the gallows on the moors above the town. Before execution, the accused witches were incarcerated in a dark and gloomy cell known as the Well Tower. They were shackled to the floor in complete darkness. One of the accused, an elderly woman known as Demdike, died in this cell before she could even face trial. The conditions killed her before the rope could. The prisoners had no defense counsel to speak for them. They could call no witnesses on their behalf. The evidence against them would not survive scrutiny in any modern court. Confessions were extracted through exhaustion and manipulation. Witnesses were children and rivals with personal grudges. A contemporary account from a prisoner at Lancaster survives. Then I was put into a tower where the smoke of the other prisoners came up so thick that I could scarcely see the candle. Besides, it rained in upon my bed. In this manner did I lie all that long, cold winter till the next assizes. My body greatly swelled and my limbs benumbed. The castle offers tours now. The view from the battlements is quite lovely. In April 1990, Strangeways Prison in Manchester erupted in the longest prison riot in British penal history. 25 days of chaos exposed what decades of official reports had concealed. Strangeways was designed by Alfred Waterhouse and opened in 1868. Between its opening and the abolition of the death penalty in 1965, 100 prisoners were executed there. But it was not the hangings that sparked the riot. It was the living conditions for those who survived. A cell measuring 13 feet by 7 feet, designed for one person, frequently housed 3 prisoners at a time. The prison was built to hold a maximum of 970 inmates. On the day the riot began, there were 1,647, 70% over capacity. Conditions had barely changed since Victorian times. Men had to urinate and defecate in buckets within their cells, then slop out the following morning. Heavy tranquilizers were routinely used to keep prisoners docile. Officers called it the liquid cosh. Buckets remained a daily reality. A former prisoner later described the daily reality. It was always brutal in Strangeways. It was the norm in there for the screws to dish out daily beatings, especially to the young and vulnerable lads. They were definitely on a power trip because they had been getting away with it for so long. On the 1st of April 1990, prisoners took control of the chapel. Within hours, the riot spread throughout most of the prison. 1 prisoner was killed. 147 officers were injured. 47 prisoners were injured. Much of the prison was damaged or destroyed. Repair costs reached £55 million. The inquiry that followed found that early press coverage had exaggerated claims of prisoner-on-prisoner torture. But it also confirmed what everyone inside already knew. The conditions were barbaric. The overcrowding was dangerous. The system had created the violence it claimed to prevent. After reopening in 1994, Strangeways became known for a different statistic. Between 1993 and 2003, it had the second highest number of inmate suicides of any prison in the United Kingdom. In 2004, it had the highest number of suicides in the country. The reforms came. The reports were filed. The suicides continued. In Gloucester, Her Majesty's Prison, Gloucester carried the weight of Britain's most notorious murder case. Frederick West was an English serial killer who committed at least 12 murders between 1967 and 1987, most alongside his second wife, Rosemary. At least 8 of these murders were committed for sexual gratification and involved rape, bondage, torture, and mutilation. The victims' dismembered bodies were buried in the cellar or garden of the West residence in Gloucester. The press called it the House of Horrors. He had become increasingly depressed after Rosemary publicly rejected him. He withdrew his earlier confessions and accused his wife of almost total responsibility for the murders. The prison had failed to prevent his suicide. The victims' families never got their day in court. A contemporary observer noted that everyone was absolutely livid. The nation was livid. Fred had cheated justice, which was a travesty. Rosemary West was convicted of 10 murders and remains in prison to this day. She has maintained her innocence for 31 years. No one believes her. HMP Leeds, known locally as Armley Prison, was one of the last prisons in Britain to carry out executions. The Victorian conditions that defined its early years persisted well into the modern era. Multiple deaths in custody sparked investigations that produced reports. The reports produced recommendations. The recommendations were filed away. Kilmainham Gaol in Dublin stands as a monument to political imprisonment. The leaders of the Easter Rising of 1916 were executed in its stone yard. Their cells had no light, no heat. Men who would become the founding fathers of the Irish Republic spent their final hours in conditions designed to break them before the bullets could. Prisoners transported from Kilmainham to the penal colonies often died en route. Those who survived wished they had not. The prison is now a museum. Visitors report an overwhelming sense of grief that permeates every corridor. Tour guides speak of feeling watched, of sudden temperature drops in the execution yard, and of a weight that settles on your chest when you enter certain cells. Finally, we come to a prison that no longer exists, but whose legacy haunts every institution we have discussed. Newgate Prison stood in London for over 700 years before its demolition in 1902. It was the gateway to hell for generations of the condemned. The phrase Newgate Frisk entered the English language. It meant the dance of hanging, the involuntary jerking of legs as a body swung from the rope. Crowds gathered to watch. They made a day of it. When Newgate was demolished, its gallows were transferred to Pentonville. The condemned cells were added, and the execution room was built. Pentonville took over from Newgate as the training location for future executioners. The hangman had to learn his trade somewhere. The site where Newgate once stood is now occupied by the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales. Lady Justice stands atop the building with her scales and sword. Beneath her feet lie the unmarked graves of executed prisoners, the Court of Justice built on bones. These wings exist. The archives are there for anyone who cares to look. And at night, when the lights go down in the old blocks, something still walks.